Welcome to Ambition's Apex, your guide to mastering the art of physique transformation and achieving peak performance across all arenas of life. Our mission is not just to sculpt bodies, but to change lives, empowering you towards excellence. Dive in with us as we explore insights and strategies designed to elevate you towards your journey of self-improvement. Enjoy the ascent. Celeste, welcome to the show. I'm very excited to have you here. How are you feeling today?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here and on the other side now, because I know we just had you on Confessions of Bikini Pro for Coaches Week, so it's nice to be on your podcast.
I know. I feel like you're always interviewing everybody else, and it's time for you to be interviewed. No pressure.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into competing.
I got into competing actually very early on after I got out of high school. I graduated high school early and I was already very interested in fitness. I wanted to personal train and I was going to go study dietetics, which actually I did study dietetics for a decent amount of time before I switched my major to psychology. But essentially, I loved fitness because it gave me an outlet for my mental health really at the beginning, which kind of backfired on me because it turned into disordered eating and body image issues. However, it really supported me as an athlete in volleyball. And then my love for fitness just grew. And I was like, I wonder how much further I can push my body. So once I knew I was no longer going to play volleyball, I decided to commit to a competition prep. And that was back in 16, I'm sorry. Actually, I don't even remember now, 2015, I think. So it was a while ago, and that was my first show, and I just wanted to see, how far I could push myself, and after that, I took some time off before competing again because I was really a jaded competitor, and then I came back with a renewed mindset, a lot of self-responsibility, and I was able to commit and take a very healthy approach.
Man, there's a lot I want to pick apart there. First of all, what are some things that you picked up from volleyball that you translated into bodybuilding?
Oh my goodness. There's so much. Actually, I was listening to your episode with Dom and I was like, so much of this I can relate to from what you were sharing, like showing up for practice. And he said, you're not going to play in the big game if you don't show up for practice. And I think a lot of it's discipline. I wanted to be the best I could be. I wanted to always be first string, which I think sometimes that probably worked against me because my identity became heavily rooted in being an athlete. But I really took the discipline and the drive and knowing that it's up to you. Even if you're on a team, it is up to you at the end of the day to do the very best you can for the team. So I carried that with me. I probably carried a lot of loyalty, honestly, where I'm able to communicate with my coach and be loyal to a coach for a long time, even if that isn't always the best, but it does help me, I think. And pushing yourself a little bit further. In volleyball, you have a coach who's there telling you, you got to do another, you got to do another. In bodybuilding, you do, but a lot of it's personal. You're in the gym pushing yourself generally. So I think knowing I had this deep-rooted desire to be better as an athlete, I took that with me in bodybuilding where I can be in the gym and get laser focused and think, okay, what do I need to feel to know I'm actually incurring growth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about this all the time. I talked about it on your podcast. I talk to my athletes about this. Having a history in athletics is very helpful when it comes to bodybuilding. I do see bodybuilding as a sport. Sometimes people debate that a little bit, but I do see it, there's so many qualities, athletic qualities that can contribute to it a lot. And, volleyball is a little bit more of a team sport and bodybuilding would be more of an individualized sport. But there's a lot of parallels in terms of after you lose a game, for example, you go and congratulate the other team on winning. There's that loyalty aspect that you mentioned with coaching. We see a lot of athletes coach hopping, the moment that there's any level of imperfection on either side. So we see a lot of that. What are some things that, because with the loyalty with the coach, there is a point where, you know, you may need to leave a coach and head to another coach. So there's some level of balance there. What are some things you would look for as an athlete where you maintain that level of loyalty to a coach, and maybe they're not always perfect, you're not always perfect, that kind of thing, right? But what are some things that may kind of trigger an athlete where there is a lot of validity to them switching coaches?
That's a good question. I think you have to look at the level of service you're getting compared to the level of service expected and agreed upon. So if you agree with your coach that you're going to receive check-ins at a particular time, you're going to get this type of feedback, this type of guidance, and those things are no longer being fulfilled, that's absolutely a valid reason to leave, especially if there was no communication from the coach as to why there was a change. I think if you notice as an athlete, your base is being built this way and you're not actually going upwards in the expectations you have as an athlete, it could be good to leave, especially if you start butting heads. Like if you genuinely know, like I was competing long enough to know that I wasn't ready for some of the shows I was put on stage for. And I think that was when I started to be like, I have to go a different direction, because what I foresee for myself as a competitor is now different than what this person sees. And at the same time, you know, when you have loyalty, I think it's very easy for coaches and competitors to develop an attachment. It really is an attachment. And you have this opportunity as a coach to develop a secure attachment with a client. And as a client, you could be at risk of becoming really codependent on your coach for validation and that kind of energy of hype. So it's important, if you start to notice you're overly attached to your coach for validation and for your worth, take a step back and really consider, is this relationship a healthy one that's going to progress me for a long time? Or is it one that I'm becoming reliant on and willing to do anything, even at the sacrifice of my own good? And that could be a sign you might need to either address the relationship or make a change.
I like that you called it a relationship and kind of a bond as well, because I definitely agree. It's a special kind of relationship and bond that you have with a coach. And, you know, there's a lot of boundaries that have to be in place on both sides. There's a lot of reflection that has to be in place on both sides. And you mentioned also that the athlete has some level of responsibility in terms of that reflection as well. If you're a little bit too dependent on the coach for validation, or wherever that validation may be coming from, sometimes that's something you need to reflect about yourself in terms of making sure that you're validating yourself and filling your own cup, and making sure that you're doing things because there's only so much a coach is getting feedback for. And, you know, we can't necessarily always pick apart an athlete completely mentally and like completely fill all those gaps and make sure that we're addressing all those tiny little things when we have so much other things to be addressing all the time, right? So sometimes it's the athlete's responsibility to monitor a lot of those mental health things, and for us to help support as much as we can along that journey, right? So you mentioned mental health stuff, and I would really like to dig into that. So how do you see mental health playing a role in bikini prep specifically, and where are some areas that you think that a lot of bikini athletes specifically struggle with?
Well, immediately what comes to mind is most females in general, competitors aside, are facing body image dissatisfaction from a very early age, whether that's from parental comments, media, or social circles. You add on top of that social media, which encourages like a really rich platform for upward comparison that can actually lead to a more negative self-esteem. And I'm not demonizing social media at all. I think it's actually quite beneficial for us to push ourselves with it, but we already are dealing with females in this aspect. Then you add on top of that competing, where you're walking on stage being judged for your physique against a very particular criteria. Now, the positive side of that is you're actually subjecting yourself to an environment of judgment that is of your choice versus maybe past bullying or comparison that others could have been putting you through. So you're actually subjecting yourself to that because you want to and you desire to, and it's a aim you're striving for. So that's positive. However, a lot of people get so wrapped up in the bikini competitor and bodybuilder identity, that they lose parts of themselves that previously could have been maybe actually beneficial to them as an athlete, but they've since let fall by the wayside because, well, I'm supposed to be this and I have to do this and I should do this. Because of that comparison, they see another successful competitor or athlete, and they start thinking, well, that's what I should do. And while in some cases that very well may be true, that they have some gaps to fill, they often forget about where they're at in their journey and the efficacy that needs to be built before they can even consider comparing to that person or being on that level. So I see that as a concern. And because most disordered eating comes as a result of body image dissatisfaction, now we're looking at a breeding ground for that difficulty to come up, especially if there was already pre-existing beliefs about food that were unhelpful or about someone's body in relation to food. You're going to see a lot more of that perpetuate potentially. But really it comes down to intention and thought process behind it. And the last thing I'll say that I will see most often is this tendency to strive for an all or nothing point of view and mentality that will lead to a lot of maladaptive behaviors, such as sweeping emotions under the rug, not addressing relationship issues when they come up, ignoring job and work responsibilities because they're starting to put this on the line, maybe even subjecting themselves to multiple opinions from outside sources that are not actually benefiting their journey, or going down a path that they never expected to go down and sacrificing their values. So that all or nothing mentality can get you so laser focused that you sacrifice what matters to you. So I'd say those are some of the bigger things I see come up.
Yeah, the body image one is a lot of that it's interesting because we mentioned some of these surface level things like body image issues and stuff like that. But when we pick that apart, it can become very complex, and there's a lot of moving parts there, and maybe traumas that girls have experienced in the past with bullying through high school, the pressure, societal pressure in terms of how we look and how we appear, and all these different things. And there's just so many variables that can contribute to that. I did find it interesting that you mentioned that it's an environment where you're selecting to place yourself under some level of scrutiny and to be picked apart visually. And I think it's important to place some level of accountability and responsibility on that you are placing yourself in that type of environment when you do get into this sport, and recognizing that kind of out the gate. I know that this sport can be very exciting to get into, and sometimes we may get into it for more emotionally driven reasons without kind of rationalizing that understanding of that we're placing ourselves in an environment where we are going to be picked apart visually. So a lot of these things can lead to a lot of, and you mentioned also relationships and all these other things, things getting swept under the rug. A lot of this can lead to all kinds of resentment towards, the sport itself, the coach that you're working with, that just people in the sport, maybe the organization that you're in terms of claiming that there's politics, whatever it may be, how these resentments kind of manifest. You mentioned that early on in your bodybuilding career that you were some level of jaded. Did you feel like you had some level of resentment towards the sport, and what were the reasons for that?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Definitely. I was so jaded. Like, I see jaded competitors now, and I almost just feel for them because I remember being in that state of mind where I just wanted to steer people away from the sport. I'm like, this is the reason for this. This is why I feel this way. But when I took a step back, and what I did really in reality was take personal responsibility for my actions and my choices, I was able to formulate a new path to bodybuilding that actually benefited me and my mind. Because previously I saw bodybuilding as a crutch to the already pre-existing issues I had with myself, with food, with sports, all of it, like this identity. And then when I took responsibility, I was able to say, well, actually, it's because I was expecting this, this, and this of myself. And that is not the healthiest intention with it. That is not the best approach I could be taking with it. And while I demonized the sport at first because I was bitter, honestly, I think I was bitter. It's like, oh, I put in all this work. I never cheated on my diet, never missed a workout, didn't do any of that. But this girl backstage who won told me about how she cheated on her. Like, I was like in that but I came from a volleyball background where you're winning points on a scoreboard. So for me, it was a mental shift to see you're literally only being judged for what you bring to the stage, not what you did last week, the week before, none of that. That the judges don't know. So that was a bit of a shift, but really at the end of the day, what it was I had to take personal responsibility and say, well, how am I going to approach this better? Because even post show, like I was still living the bodybuilder life. I was still prepping my meals. I was still going to the gym. So that didn't change. And I was like, if I'm still doing this, then what is so different or bad about competing? The only difference is I got on stage. And granted, pushed to maybe particular levels of conditioning you wouldn't on a normal day-to-day basis. But in reality, it was just I demonized the act of it because I once used it as a crutch, and now I use it as something that really adds to my life.
Yeah, that's a lot of that's very interesting. I'm a very observant person in general, and I've been in this industry for quite some time. And we see this time and time again where athletes have a similar type of experience. I've actually kind of had a little bit of that myself in the past as well. My second show, I was pretty bitter afterwards, just from the entire experience. And you see the shift. You can see athletes where they start to vent about these things on social media or wherever it may be. And then you'll start to see this like shift over time where they're like, wait, like I have a lot of responsibility to take here, and it sounds like that's kind of what happened to you as well. So a lot of the things that I've mentioned is and encouraged is like trying to find that responsibility and accountability earlier on, or when you're getting into the sport and understanding these things a little bit better. I am very empathetic that a lot of these things come with time and experience, and it's a level of maturity too, just personal maturity, but trying to see these things on the front end so that you can like save yourself some of this anger and resentment and maybe a little bit of embarrassment too when you're maybe making emotional posts on social media and stuff, or bashing people, or when a lot of responsibility and accountability can just be taken yourself. Is that kind of what you experienced a little bit as well?
Yeah, like I don't necessarily look back and cringe. Sometimes Facebook memories I will, because they have a funny way of showing you the worst of what you've ever posted. But for the most part, I recognize where I was coming from, and I understand like I wasn't matured from that experience yet. I was seeking to place blame on something. And I think this is actually a pretty normal response. And it's worth mentioning that when we go through something challenging, our mind will seek anything that possibly led to that or resembles it or looks like it as a means to prevent it from happening again. So what happens is if we don't consider where that's actually coming from, okay, my brain is telling me that I should avoid dieting because of competing and it looks like that, but really it was the way you dieted. It wasn't the diet itself, it was the way you dieted. It was the way you thought about dieting. But our brain will make a shortcut to blame the diet. And to take this out of context, we see this in any sort of trauma specifically, but any negative type of experience will do that. If someone gets into a car accident, they generally are a little apprehensive to get into the car again, not because they're blaming the car, but because they're worried about what's going to happen on the road, or do they trust themselves? So we look for things to attribute meaning to that aren't necessarily always the reason that happened, but we need that association as a means for protection.
That's very, very, very good. I agree completely. And yeah, it's a level of like lesson learning, and it's kind of like touching a hot stovetop. You don't go touch the hot stovetop again, and you blame the stovetop. You don't, or you can blame fire or heat or whatever it may be, and you're just finding that place to blame. And it's like, I'm going to stay away from that in other areas too, or whatever it may be. What are some other like common mental health challenges that competitors face during preparation phases? Outside of like dieting, we discussed coaching a little bit. What are some other variables that we see sometimes?
I think specifically in a prep, you'll see this tendency to oversimplify everything to the point of going on autopilot mode. And the reason I think this is a potential red flag or sabotage when it comes to mental health is because it takes you out of a state of mindfulness. Why would that even matter to a competitor? Well, it's been proven that when you make choices mindfully, your self-esteem actually goes up. As a competitor, you probably want your self-esteem up, considering you're going to be getting on stage in front of all these people. And also, what are you doing every day? You mentioned it on my podcast, that the performance is the process. And so if you have high self-esteem while executing on the process, the chances are you're going to have a more fulfilling experience. But in prep, I often see athletes say, well, I'm just going to go into autopilot mode. I'm going to only eat the same meals. I'm not going to think about eating those meals. I'm going to eat them like a vacuum as fast as I can, go on about my day. I'm going to go through the motions with my training, with my cardio. And that going through the motions ends up translating to a really negative, generally what I see, a really negative post-show experience, because they were so used to being on autopilot mode that the moment something looks a little bit different or introduces a little bit more flexibility and freedom, it's like, I don't know what to do with it. And then it's, well, now I've messed up and let me go off the rails. So that's probably my biggest predictor or red flag, is if someone's in autopilot mode, they're not just limiting their potential for feeling great about themselves and their process, but they're also setting themselves up for potential future failures.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, so you talked about autopilot. We talked about like sweeping things under the rug too. And we've talked a lot about like rationalizing these things in general, like sitting instead of just letting emotions drive you, and being conscious of some of these kind of trauma responses that we've discussed as well. And sometimes I often recommend people to just go sit in a dark room by themselves and just think about things, reflect on things, try not to dig too far into the past or too far into the future. We talked about this on your podcast a little bit as well, but just kind of analyze like, what are some recent things that have been going on? What can I learn from them? Am I responding to these things in an appropriate way? How can I respond to things better? And then focusing on like, what's the next step ahead, that kind of stuff. And, you know, a lot of these things, we'll see competitors do this too, especially like post-show, is distracting themselves from like sitting with that, right? And like sitting with that difficult kind of internal conversation that they need to have with themselves. And so they'll distract themselves with whatever may be food, partying, and complete, or even sometimes the anger or the resentment can be some level of distraction from taking that responsibility too. So what are some ways that competitors can maybe be more mindful of these things, maybe some practices that they can put into their routine to kind of stay on top of this kind of, I would almost call it mental hygiene, rather than letting it pile up and giving you a much bigger mess to deal with later on?
You know, I always say that the answer is in the question, because generally when we ask a question like that, we already know what we need to do. We need to have a routine. We need to do things consistently. We need to have an understanding of what our actual needs are versus our perceived needs. So generally, if someone's asking a question, why am I struggling so much post-show and I can't get a hold of my food? And it's like, okay, well, when were you ever a hold of your food? Like, when did you ever have an understanding of it? And to implement mindfulness on a consistent basis, I think the easiest way to do that is to immediately implement it into things you're already doing every day. So if you're already waking up and weighing yourself, okay, before you weigh yourself, let's ask a question. Hey, what am I proud of myself for yesterday? What am I looking forward to today? What are some things that I'm going to commit to in this focus of the week? And make sure you outline those things for yourself mentally, so we don't become hyper fixated on the scale, which is a representation of an outcome versus a process. So I really encourage athletes to shift to process orientation. So then you go about your day, and let's say you're heading into your first meal. Well, it's not just your blueberries and oats and egg whites because your coach told you that that's on your meal plan. It's, okay, well, how are these foods specifically benefiting me, not just in my journey as a competitor, but potentially in my focus at work, potentially in my ability to be present with my family or other things that I value. And then maybe set a check-in around 2:30, 3, especially if that's when your work starts slowing down, or 4 p.m., whenever it is that you notice those high anxiety feelings come up, maybe those urges to go eat off your plan. That's when you should be doing consistently a mental check-in with yourself. How am I feeling right now? When was the last time I took a deep breath? Like, how often do I actually go outside and just like sit in the sun for 2 minutes? So many people can't even put their phone down for 2 minutes. Like you said, go sit in a dark room. So set yourself up with what you already have in your day. You don't need to do so much. Just a little bit can go a long way. So setting an alarm like that. And then before the end of the day, do a reflection for yourself every day. Reflect on what the day looked like. What meals made you feel really good? What maybe didn't make you feel so great? What are your intentions for today that you actually executed on? And if you didn't, what stopped you, and how can you prevent that in the future? You said something really great earlier, which was a lot of people aren't willing to think about these things before they enter. If you don't, then what's going to happen is every time you get up on a roadblock, you're going to pretend like you didn't see it coming and it shouldn't be there, and you're going to freak out because you didn't know what to do. But if you are able to humble yourself enough to be aware that something could get in your way, that you prepare a plan for if it were to happen, if this, then that, and then you can actually move around it, you're setting yourself up for success more than the person who assumes they're untouchable. So I guess that's a pretty decent way of applying these things into your daily life as far as mindfulness goes. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. I think a lot of this also comes down to a level of mental discomfort that you're willing to get into in terms of some of these practices, because these conversations that you have with yourself or some of these practices can be pretty eye-opening in terms of like, oh, I really need to get it together mentally, or oh, I really don't have things as figured out as I thought, and I've just been kind of floating through things and distracting myself with, like you said, not being able to put your phone down, not like going outside, maybe having thinking about your food in a different way. A lot of like, your mind may be taking easier ways out from having those discussions with yourself or sitting down and really analyzing what's going on, because sometimes those things can be very eye-opening. It's like, oh, maybe I'm not as much of a saint as as I think I am, or whatever it may be, right? And these conversations with ourselves can be challenging. So it's important to have them, though, because when we address these things, we're able to take a much better path forward. We're able to address the issues that come up a lot better. We're able to analyze situations and make better decisions when they do come up. I also like that you talked about the way we think about our food, like your breakfast, for example. It's having some level of gratitude too, because especially as women, you guys when we discuss this on your podcast, that scarcity mindset can come up and that can really have a negative downstream trickle effect in a lot of areas of your life. If you're feeling like there's some level of scarcity, and food can be the trigger for this, then you're going to operate from a position of scarcity. And your mentality is going to drift into a lot of negative pathways, and you're not going to feel very happy. So it takes the gratitude practices of like having appreciation for your food is a very simple thing. It's like, hey, I am grateful to have this food in front of me. This food is doing a lot for me outside of just body composition things, and I think that can help a lot with your relationship with food. Now, you touched on post-show blues, and this is another topic that I think is a lot more complicated than people give it credit for, because I don't think it's just one singular like reason behind it. I don't think, and the post-show blues is a term that can be used outside of bodybuilding too. They use it for I've heard it be used for choirs and like orchestra performers, where they're like working up towards a performance, and there's so much purpose and energy driven into each little task that they have daily, and the practices and all these different things, and then they have the performance, and then they're left kind of empty, right? So what are some other contributing factors you think play into the post-show blues that people might not think about?
That they might not think about. I think just from a functioning level, that you went for so long focusing and celebrating a particular result, that once you got to that pinnacle of it, now you don't have something else that you're putting that same amount of energy and effort towards that feels as maybe pressing. So generally we see a decrease in dopamine and norepinephrine. So now your ability to do the hard thing and actually feel rewarded by doing it has decreased. So you have to be prepared for the fact that like some of this is just physiological. When you're striving for something amazing and you're actually getting there and executing on it, especially if it's your first time, like this isn't normal life for you, I think we see a bigger hit of post-show blues when someone hasn't actually changed their perspective to this is my life, this is how I live. I have a competitor who sometimes is prepping for a show and sometimes is improving, and I don't need a timeline. I don't need a show date in those times. And so there's a change in identity. I don't think a lot of people consider the identity, and that actually comes with grief. We grieve a version of ourselves we knew on prep. I hear competitors all the time say, I just miss who I was in prep. Why can't I be as disciplined as I was in prep? And I'm like, it's not a discipline issue. It's an identity issue, you know? So I see that very often. I'm sure you hear that all the time too as a coach.
Absolutely. And that's what I mean by saying that it's very complex, because I think the identity thing plays a role. I think that the body image stuff plays a role in that grieving as well, where you're like grieving the fact that, you know, you had that look and something that you were very happy with, and it led to success and a bunch of validation and attention, and everybody was so excited for you, and then that's gone. We also have that thing where we talk about sweeping things under the rug, or maybe not addressing things mentally, and you've been distracting yourself with prep too, and maybe using that as a distraction where you have cardio to do, you have all these tasks to do all the time, and maybe you haven't sit in a room and like really analyze what's going on in your head and who you are and like the things that are important to you or whatever it may be. And then there is that like sense of purpose and drive towards something, and that pinnacle that you kind of mentioned as well, where after that it's kind of gone, and like what's the next step sort of thing, and you're kind of lost to some extent. And then if you start picking up these distractions where you're you could be binge eating, you could be doing for men it could be like video games or whatever it is, right? Just distracting yourself even more instead of really sitting down and addressing, or maybe channeling all that negative energy into resentment towards the sport itself, your coach, your relationships, all these different things. So there's so many contributing factors when it comes to these mental health aspects of bodybuilding, and it can be such a challenge. So kind of in tandem with post-show blues, we see a lot of binge eating and disordered eating after shows. What are some ways that you think that competitors can help prevent that, or be more equipped and prepared heading into kind of reverse dieting phases and post-show phases?
Yeah, so I'm going to backtrack slightly because I think you mentioned something really good, which is like that validation. I often think we don't consider what needs were being met in prep that are no longer being met post-show or in an improvement season, especially in the same way. So you might actually become vulnerable, yes, to seeking validation in other ways too. And that could put you in a whole host of other issues within your life. But fast forward to your next question, which is how can you prevent it? And then how can you address it? So for prevention, I think something that's very much overlooked is actually grounding yourself through the meals, which we just spoke about that. So I won't rehash it, but being present enough to understand why you're eating what you're eating outside of body composition and the result it could lead to is big. I think it's better to further the gap between how you perceive food and how you perceive body than it is to bring those together. Generally with competitors, it's like, oh, I ate this meal. How did it affect how I look? So that becomes a really tight bond. But I think it's better to try to at least pull that bond apart as much as we can as competitors, where it doesn't become a this defined me or this food is worth demonizing because it didn't have a great effect. Those types of things are not so healthy. I think also when it comes to disordered eating, if there are underlying physiological needs that aren't being addressed by the coach, I think that can actually be a major concern, where I've seen, unfortunately, like girls will say, I keep binging because I can't stick to my plan. And I'm like, well, okay, well, what causes you to go into a binge? Well, I overate like 200 calories off my plan. And I said, F it, I already ruined it. Now I'm going overboard. It's like, okay, well, on average, if you actually added like 200 calories a day to your plan with your coach, you'd probably be in a better spot, because mentally now you're okay with doing it. It's allowed, versus, oh, now I'm potentially 15,000 calories over with some of the binges that I've seen. And then on top of that, as far as prevention goes, I think we have to be real and honest with ourselves to say, what do I need post-show that's actually going to make this sustainable, but also still challenge me? We're going to be rewarded most when we feel we're growing and we're challenged in some way, right? That's a big reason why prep is so nice. But also, like in improvement season, I think we have to say, what can I realistically commit to for a long period of time and foresee myself doing in any circumstance, and know that it's productive? Because otherwise you're going to be like, I have to be so perfect and militant, just like I was on prep, that you forget there's so much outside of that. And that can lead to then that pendulum swing. So if you think of like a major pendulum swing, you're looking at like, this is your extreme of prep, this is your extreme of post-show or improvement season. Someone who's going here is way more likely, I think, to swing up here. But all this in between, what would make it a smaller swing is if they were mindful about why they're doing what they're doing, if they considered the benefit to doing what they're doing, even considering how it connects to their core values. And if they were considering, okay, now that I've gone down this pathway of potentially disordered eating, am I willing to get myself out of it? Or am I going to use the excuse of going back to the extreme of prep, which you've probably had athletes say to you, coach, put me back, put me back in, put me back on prep. I want to do a show. That was the last time I was in control. But it's not control. It's perceived control. So usually control is the perceived need and congruency is the real desire. So you think you need control, you really need congruency. Congruency happens when your ideal self is aligned with your actual self. And these things coexist really beautifully. And I think most of the times the root for competitors is not the diet. And most mental health people will tell you, now I'm going to rant. Most mental health people will tell you like, oh, quit competing, give it up. It's ruining you. I am not under that impression, because to me that perpetuates using an extreme to address a problem. I'm under the impression that it's much better to meet someone where they're at and find a healthier intention or approach or focus with it that allows them to be fulfilled in the process. So I actually promote continuing what you're doing, but let's look at it different. How did you see it before that was inconducive? How do you need to see it now? And are you willing to let go of what you thought you needed to do in order to actually do what's necessary to get there? So disordered, it just means not in a normal fashion. Most of us in bodybuilding are not normal, but it's how it affects your daily life that makes it disordered. That's where it actually presents as a problem. So if we can turn potential risk factors and we address each risk with a strength or a benefit or a helpful behavior or tactic, I think we can mitigate a lot of the risks that come with something like competing. That was such a big rant. I'm sorry. I
No,
could
that was fantastic. It's so great that we're talking about these things, because I think one of the key drivers, like I said, these things are very complex. There's so many different variables that can be contributing to these behaviors, especially something like disordered eating, where especially in a position, because we discussed what can contribute to post-show blues, and there's so many things like moving pieces here that can be driving these kinds of behaviors. And I think one of the key drivers that we didn't really discuss is just realistic expectations too. And we talked about like educating yourself a little bit more and having better expectations getting into it on the front end. We talked about this on your podcast as well. And I think that this can help a lot, because a lot of people are just like, okay, like mentally, even if they've been told like, you're going to have to go through a reverse dieting phase, it's extremely important. It's arguably one of the most important pieces to this entire process in terms of getting you back to a spot where we're going to be able to do this again in a healthy fashion. But even though they're hearing that, it's just like they're like, yeah, whatever. But in their mind, they're like, once the show's done, I get to go eat with friends. I just have this freedom all of a sudden, right? And so I think being realistic with yourself and having that, like being really firm to some extent, is important. I think it's a very delicate balance with these things. The coach needs to be conscious of this, where we're trying to bring us back to a level of balance. We can't just maintain some level of extreme. And that's something I've worked on a lot with my coaching over the years with reverse dieting, is like, where do we find this balance? Because incorporating maybe free meals again, like out the gate. And it's kind of dependent on the person too, because if we can ideally reverse out just really precise, like that's, a perfect world. And some athletes will be capable of doing that. But some athletes, it's like, we're probably better off starting like the reverse diet at a higher calorie point and incorporating free meals or even like intuitive days, like out the gate, because it's going to mitigate like just screw it for weeks on end. Right. And then it's also like when you're trying to catch it too, it can be very difficult, because it's like at some point, a coach like myself, if somebody's really challenged with these things, and I'm doing everything within my power to like find some level of balance with them and really working to achieve that with them. And it's just like they just can't find it. No matter what I do, there's some level of responsibility that needs to be taken, because it's like I'm like, hey, there's literally nothing else I can do at this point besides just tell you that we need to get back on track. And then, like you said, a lot of athletes will be like, well, I just want to go back into a diet now. It's like, well, you know, that's not necessarily realistic. So this is another like realistic expectation sort of thing. And one of my past mentors, Austin Stout, posted this, I think it might have been today actually, talking about realistically, a lot of competitors really only have 1 to 3 shots at doing like an extreme diet phase before their body's really going to start fighting back, like realistically. And you're not going to be able to be as ready for a show anymore. And if you're going through these extreme dieting phases and then you're really blowing out the reverse diet and not taking the time to go into health phases and I like that you mentioned longer, like long off-season phases and really taking your time, because this sport is a marathon, not a sprint. I say this all the time. It's one of the most common sayings you'll hear in this sport as well. So recognizing these things, and if anybody's listening that's like thinking about getting into competing, I just hope that they're listening and understanding these things, maybe setting more realistic expectations for themselves and understanding the importance of these things. So outside of reverse dieting, what are some other important like things that we need to consider coming out of a show, and some things that we need to hold in high importance?
Well, I really appreciate everything you just shared, especially from a coach perspective. And you used a really important phrase, which is it depends on the person. And that, I think, points to the importance of mental health. And when I entered into the industry as someone who was going to provide that service for competitors, I never wanted to compete with coaches. I wanted to support coaches in how they're able to actually get the most out of their clients, because I understand, like you do, it is person dependent. Why is it that one person can reverse perfectly and then another person can really struggle, fall off the face of the earth, and you get ghosted and you never hear from them again? And so that's where I think you did everything and you do everything you can as a coach. And then, yes, the person does have to say, I probably need more help. I think something that we have to consider is overconfidence. You talked about setting expectations, realistic expectations. I think a lot of this gets maybe messed up when someone has an overconfidence in a future version of themselves. So they're like, okay, once I get through this prep, I'll just be able to eat a couple meals out, take a week off, go on vacation. There's this overconfidence in a version of them they've not yet met. That's not highly considerate of everything else they've put their body through or everything else that's going on in their life. So while visualization is great, and I would encourage someone to visualize themselves coming out of a show and having a great, successful reverse diet, it would be with the understanding of specific action steps and commitments and standards, not this, oh, Frufi, visualize yourself doing amazing. Like, no, because then you're going to create this really conflated view of yourself that you can handle anything and you can do anything, and you probably can. I'm not going to tell you to not believe in yourself. I am, but do it with proof. So harness the proof you have, harness the strengths that you have, and you can show evidence that you display these strengths and this confidence, and then identify how you're going to use that specifically with an action plan. So this is where we would maybe, I wrote a book a long time ago, so I call it Operation Badass, but this is like, this is where you take your end result and you work it backwards to really create what it is that you need to do to get to that end result. So this is where people miss the mark, is they just say, well, I'm just going to, I'm going to prep and then I'm going to do my reverse diet and everything will be good. But it's like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to execute on your reverse diet? What would it mean, and how would it look for you to actually walk away from this season feeling really proud of yourself and confident in the decisions that you've made? And if you can't identify specific action steps or commitments and standards that align with that, you're not going to know it when you see it. And if you already have a tendency to look down on yourself or be a bit neurotic and crazy on like the perfectionist details, you will lose yourself in that process. So as a competitor, harness your tendency to be focused on a goal and utilize that to your advantage by saying, okay, I'm going to be cognizant of, I'm going to hit my water intake. It might seem basic, but it falls by the wayside very easily. Okay, I'm going to make sure I'm prepping my meals. A successful improvement season looks like being able to go out on a date or with my family. And this is how I'm going to communicate that with my coach and break it down for you. Make it so simple that even the most reverted version of yourself that regresses to the farthest you've ever been could still follow and execute. So lose the overconfidence by making a plan for a regressed version of you, with the understanding that there's already a version of you that exists that's overcome very challenging, difficult things and is therefore capable of expecting this of yourself.
I like that overconfidence piece because that's definitely something we see a lot with competitors. And I'm definitely not telling people that they shouldn't take vacations or anything, but maybe like the weekend after a show isn't the best time to go like fly to Mexico at like an all-inclusive resort where you get to just eat as much as you want and drink as much alcohol as you want. And a lot of times we'll see competitors do that, even though you've like as a coach, like myself, I'm always trying to communicate as much as like I would err on the side of over communicating. So I really express the importance of the reverse diet and like how important it is, not especially if the athlete wants to do this again sometime, because if we, and I talk about this too, where realistically we're going to have some level of negative feedback during a contest prep if you really want to be competitive a lot of time, or we're going to run the risk of that to some extent. And if you have something like dysbiosis, for example, and your the bacterial profile in your gut is a little bit out of whack, and we're coming out of a relatively extreme diet, and then you're going and just tossing all kinds of stuff on it, it's definitely going to just make that worse. It's fuel to the fire. So there's a lot of things that athletes just don't take into consideration, and they really need to trust their coach on this when we express the importance of these things, because you know, there's a lot of variables here that we're thinking of that we don't necessarily like. We don't want to get into the nitty gritty and the complications of what some of this stuff means, but we're just trying to express the importance of something. So, you know, trying to overcome that maybe slightly delusional sense of confidence post-show is really important. And understanding, especially if you want to do this again, like I said, a lot of athletes, the more you go into these extreme dieting phases and the more you're blowing out your reverse diets, the more you're not focused on the longevity in the sport and taking long health phases and doing what you need to in terms of your health and mental health primarily. A lot of this stuff is just going to correlate with all of it, and making sure that we're doing these things, like you're really going to be burning that bridge in order to be able to be successful in the future as well. So man,
Sean, can I say something about that?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Health is like something we forget as competitors, and I can willingly admit this about myself too. We get so focused on like, I want to build the best physique possible, that we forget that we are bodies and we have a gut and we have, and I know Jack about this, so this is more something you would be talking about, I'm sure, but I've had to come to terms with the fact that like, I can't just eat like whatever I want because it fits my macros. Like there's certain things that can lead to becoming, if you gain too much weight post-show because you were eating a ton of sugar and binging, like you could run the risk of actually becoming like pre-diabetic. Like why are we forgetting this side of things? So many of us, we enter with this desire to be healthy and exude a healthy lifestyle, but we forget competing is an extreme that threatens health. And that's not to say you're never going to recover from it. I mean, come on, we're here, we're doing it, it's great. You can have longevity in this sport if I think you stay mindful of that. So that's another overlooked component. It's like, okay, you can't listen to your coach who's saying probably don't go on a booze vacation when you have a gut issue because it will just feed off of that. We can't listen because all we're thinking about is, well, I can just lose the weight when I get home. But it's not about that. So I'm so glad you touched on that, because part of what we can do is tap into another reason outside of your physique to do these things. And if you feel threatened by this could affect me in this way, and this way, and this way, you might actually pause more to think about what you're doing just because there's now resistance to a potentially negative side effect.
Absolutely. And I like that you mentioned like the if it fits your macros thing. Sometimes I feel like that strategy too post show can be a little bit detrimental, because if somebody gets just, and I'm relatively evidence based in how I coach and everything, and flexible dieting is something I incorporate sometimes with my athletes, but post show it may not be the best strategy sometimes, because if you just get the taste of an Oreo, like, you could be screwed. You know what I mean? And then before you know it, the entire container's gone. And so sometimes it's incorporating and really, really prioritizing whole foods post show. And then, like I said, vacation may not be the best. Like, if you had it scheduled like 2 years ago or something, I don't know, but maybe like during your prep, scheduling a vacation maybe isn't the best route to take, like during the contest prep, and going somewhere immediately after. Maybe save that for after the reverse dieting phase. That's definitely something I would recommend. What are some signs kind of earlier on that athletes should be conscious of and self-aware of when it comes to disordered eating?
I would say overfixation on how the food is affecting their body image specifically, or how their body looks. That's likely gonna be considered disordered, and that it then skews the way you see yourself. Another thing to be mindful of is, are you justifying things like chewing and spitting because you're not actually ingesting it, but really you do start ingestion and now you're stressing out your gut, and you justify that? And are you someone who's like, well, I can work this off. I can do extra cardio. I can just take away from my meal later. So you bargain with yourself. If you're bargaining with yourself, you are on the verge of creating a really negative cycle of, I overeat or I binge or I just eat off my plan. Because some people will call it a binge, and I'm like, you had 2 extra rice cakes and you're over there doing an hour of cardio. Like, something's not adding up, So either way, though, we see this cycle. You go off your plan, you feel guilty. So in order to extinguish the guilt, you do something over dramatic, like cut food, overdo cardio, potentially purge. Purging is not just throwing up, but purging can be extra cardio, less food, etc. And then after your purge, you think, oh, well, I'm fine, because what happens is it justifies the behavior. As soon as you find a solution for overcoming what just happened and getting rid of the guilt, you now justify it, and it creates this cycle, and that cycle gets worse. If you notice that you're avoiding certain situations socially or relationally because food is involved, food is there, and you don't trust yourself, that's probably a sign that a problem is developing, if not already is developed. If you find yourself questioning when your coach wants to give you more food or to, give you a refeed or those types of things, and you're nervous about how it's going to affect you and your body, or how you're going to fill that extra food, that's probably a bad sign. Be cognizant if you are so attached to your food scale that you can no longer trust yourself to eat a normal meal out. If anyone is more prepared to eat intuitively, it's a competitor who's been weighing their food for like a year, if not more. But we create this story that we can't make conscious decisions for ourselves without the scale. So if you become over dependent on MyFitnessPal, scale, a meal plan, over dependence on something like that, that's not a great sign. You should be able to step back and make food decisions consciously without those tools. And probably if you're overutilizing things like, I guess you could call them diet hacks, volume eating, overconsumption of caffeine, chewing gum, anything like that you're finding yourself developing a strict reliance on, or utilizing it in moments that are not that threatening. Okay, your coach removed a rice cake from your plan. That's 9 grams of carbs maybe. And you're feeling like it's the end of the world. You're so hungry that you have to add 3 cups of lettuce somewhere. That's not good. So I'll leave it at that. That's a pretty decent list. Those are some things to look out for.
Yeah, I really like that you are calling like the overcompensation of doing extra expenditure as purging, as a form of purging. I'd never thought of it that way, and that's a really valuable perspective. And you mentioned a lot of things here that like most competitors are probably going to do at some point. Like chewing gum or like the volume stuff, these are things that a lot of competitors, I would say most competitors are going to do at least one of these things at some point during a prep. I would say, especially if they're really going to be ready for the show and really in a position where their body's in an extreme spot.
But that's strategic. That's strategic. It's when someone's using it, like they're post-show, maybe they're 10 weeks post-show and they're still utilizing these diet hacks. They're getting the lowest carb, the lowest fat. Like that's when I think I really actually encourage strategic use of these things, but I discourage it when it starts to affect, like you have a lower distress tolerance because you've made yourself so comfortable in a process that's not really supposed to be that comfortable.
Absolutely. And then you mentioned not trusting yourself as well. So that's why I really love free meals and why I like calling them free meals and not cheat meals, because you have that level of freedom and you have a window to do it, and you can do whatever the hell you want. You can eat as much as you want. One time a week is not going to be detrimental to you. And having that available to you that you can look forward to, and then you set a boundary with yourself where it's like, okay, I'm done after 45 minutes. So I'll tell a lot of my athletes, it's like, once you're done, don't go home and continue the grazing process. And like you said, negotiating with yourself where you're like, oh, this is just a part of my free meal. And you're up until 2 a.m. after that night out with family, just eating junk food, right? So like having that window of freedom is really important where you can really just have full freedom. Because if you're like, oh, well, I'll take a rice cake and slap some almond butter on it and just eyeball this jelly that I'm putting on it. Before you know it, if you start to incorporate it as a practice, you're going to negotiate with yourself and justify where you're just adding a little bit more each time, a little bit more. Before you know, you just have this like rice cake that's just drenched in almond butter and jelly that you're eating. And that's probably not good. So all those things are really, really valuable to consider. How do you recommend addressing? I mean, you've already mentioned some of this stuff, but what are some other things you recommend to address some of these issues, both personally and within the community in general?
Yeah, well, like with a lot of my clients, we take a deep dive approach straight off the bat, except I'm a pro utilizing resources and immediately addressing issues versus sitting in the shit too long. You already know it stinks. Get out. Let's address it. You know what I'm saying? So I'm very strengths focused in that regard. And I like to encourage people to take a compassionate approach. So when we think about addressing this, there's a million resources flying through my head that I provide my clients and ways that you should address this and go through it. But it starts with compassion. It starts with the ability to step back and say, I acknowledge the way I'm feeling or what's happening. I'm going to allow it to be, but I'm not going to allow it to actually direct my behaviors any further. And I'm going to take the time to understand it. If you're and that's a DBT practice, it's AAU, it's self-validation. So if you can utilize that, you're more likely to get comfortable recognizing where some of those gaps are that we talked about earlier, and then being willing to fill those gaps or address them. When you're thinking about food and body specifically, the history can go back so far for some people. And while I do believe it's important to address some things, especially if they're rooted in trauma, I mean, even in competitors, I think something that is not talked about often, but happens a lot, is there's a history of sexual trauma. And they use their body as control of their body as a way to protect themselves from it. And then also weight loss type of trauma, you could say, or experiences. So they're used to, oh, I was once 150 pounds overweight. I lost that. Now the thought of gaining weight scares them. So there are some things from the past that we might need to sift through and address in order to find comfort and safety in taking a new approach and taking on a new identity that isn't a dieter identity or isn't someone who is trying to protect themselves. And this is the only way they have control. But taking it further than that, I really think meeting a person where they're at and understanding not all binge eating is coming because you're extra hungry. Not all binging is coming because you're trying to hide something. Not all binge eating is coming because of restriction. Some people just have different experiences with it, and it could come up because of self-sabotage, or it could come up because they are already falling into a justification pattern, or they have preferences in their mind that actually don't have any logical reasoning. So meeting people where they're at is important, but I think it does start with the compassion. And sometimes we have to demonstrate the compassion for someone to help them see, well, I could see how this could happen because of XYZ. So they can have like a sigh of relief, like, oh, okay, like I'm not crazy. Like I've worked with hundreds, thousands of competitors. And I have people come to me and they still think they're the only one going through it. And I'm like, I promise you. Then they get on a group call and they're like, oh, it was so nice to hear these women share these similar experiences. I'm like, girl, we've been doing this since 2018. This is not a new thing. Like, if you're facing this, it's better to address it now than to think, oh, it's just going to go away. So it would be hard to say there's a specific approach I would take because it's so dependent on a person, but I'm very compassion forward, solutions focused, and prioritizing creating and harnessing a new identity, because with that comes new intentions and new standards you hold yourself to that are more aligned with what's going to help you to live a fulfilling and empowered life.
Absolutely. And, you know, us as coaches, we're always trying to figure out like solutions for these things, at least us coaches that care about health, because, you know, it's such a delicate balance, and there's only so much we can do as coaches ourselves, where we're trying to be competitive and push athletes to extremes and then manage like adverse effects. And it's very, like you said, it's very case dependent. So a lot of times we don't know what we're going to get like post show. Like, you know, an athlete could have been like stellar through a prep and like showing no signs of distress, and then all of a sudden shit hits the fan post show. It's like you know, there's only so much we can do in terms of trying to manage these things and find solutions. And it's so case dependent. Like you said, there could be maybe unresolved traumas that they're bringing into the sport to begin with that we don't even know about. And certain things that may not even be appropriate for us to address as coaches either. Like, you know, those may not be things that we should be trying to discuss with our clients. So it's like very complicated and can be very complex. What are some resources that you have and are providing for your athletes?
Yeah. And also, I think you bring up a good point. Some competitors don't tell you what's going on. You only know what you know. Similarly, within a therapeutic practice, like I remember when I was working at a counseling center, I'm like sitting there one time and this person was telling me the story, and I'm realizing like I'm only going to hear the aspects of this story that support them in getting what they need from this session. People will only share what they believe is worthy of sharing based on maybe a bias they've already curated in their head or a solution they've already curated. So sometimes you'll probably have a client who's like, oh yeah, like throughout my whole prep, I always had XYZ. And you're like, what? I didn't know you were having 300 milligrams of caffeine on top of your yohimbine and on top of your, you know what I'm saying? Like you could end up finding these things out way later because people aren't going to always openly disclose it. And now you're dealing with almost something you didn't even know was there. When it comes to resources I provide for my clients, well, okay, so most of the people start with my food relationship program, and they're getting access to not just like one-on-one support from me every single day and coaching calls as well, but also a library of resources, things from habit tracking to a whole workshop on the scale and how to change your relationship with your weight and the way you perceive that, body image resources from what even is body image, how do you redefine it, overcoming the extreme mentality and learning when to actually harness that for greatness as an athlete, setting up your ideal life. I have emotional health resources ranging from like some of the DBT resources we just discussed all the way to actual coping skills. You'd be surprised how many people have been to therapy for 5 years and never got a list of coping skills. I'm like, what? This is like the first step. Like you got to learn how to like securely ground yourself and support yourself. I provide like food and mood charts. So this is something that is highly beneficial, but rather than going through a whole list of that, I'll share, I do have free resources for competitors too. I wanted to make it really accessible because I think it is something that's missing. So if you guys are looking for support with food relationship or post-show blues, I have free series for that. I offer one-on-one support through that too. Like you can email me your workbook as you go. It's highly intensive, the food relationship free series. It's psychoeducational, so you're getting a video explaining things, and you have a full workbook to go through, guiding you through that process. And then I have an on-demand mindset coaching platform that's really valuable for a low amount of money, and you get access to a full community. So I guess that kind of answers the question. I mean, I'm incorporating mindfulness and psychological principles with personal experience and the counseling techniques that I learned in formal education.
Hmm. Yeah, that's awesome that you have so many resources and are hitting things from so many different angles. And if any competitors listening can take anything from this, is understand that this stuff is very complicated and can be very complex and can have so many moving parts and variables to it. And to make sure that you're working with coaches that care about these things to some extent. Like I said, it's a delicate balance for us. There's only so much we can do at times, where we do have a lot of competitors come to us, they're hiring us to, like, they want to be competitive, right? So like we're going to place that as the priority, but making sure that your coach has some level of care about these things and is having the conversations, because these conversations aren't easy to have. And you'll hear that I'm like trying to figure out which pathways to head down sometimes with these with some of these topics, because it's like, okay, there's so many variables here, which path are we heading down? And a lot of it kind of comes full circle. We're like intertwining some of it. So it's very important stuff. And man, it's just, there's so many different things to cover. And sometimes I see a lot with bikini competitors too. There's some level of, and this may be a little bit controversial, I don't have a ton of knowledge on this, so forgive me, anybody, if I'm wrong, but there have been a lot of studies that show a lot of women and girls that are younger too, like in high school and stuff, kind of gravitate with each other towards things. So like eating disorder stuff, like I've seen studies on like cutting too, like self-harm, where girls will kind of come together and like group together into these groups. And I do feel like we see that with bikini a little bit, where girls tend to group up with each other. Is that something you see and something that you think contributes to some of these issues?
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, because there is recent research that showcases this progression in girls from girlhood to womanhood, really. And we generally see it when there's positive affirmation of a result or of a certain thing. Now, women, if they see their peers getting positive affirmation for something, they're more likely to actually try to replicate that in some way. I'm going to say something controversial. Don't cancel me, but like, tell me why all of a sudden, like, everything in the competing world became very much lingerie photo shoots that were no longer as focused on the physique and fitness, because what we saw were very admirable, amazing women starting to do this. They get tons of likes. There's a correlation between social media likes and interest as well in the replication of behavior. It became a model for success. So then you see, well, now I'm going to do that. Now this person's doing it. Now everybody after a show is doing that. Even if they were no longer, even if they were previously not comfortable with something like that, they now consider it or entertain the idea because they see their peers doing it and being rewarded for it. I think what we can do as women to moderate this is to actually, one, understand who am I and what are my values and what do I believe in and how do I want the world to perceive me. I've fallen down that trap personally when I got into fitness in the beginning. I'm like, this is what fitness influencers do. Like, you do your hump day booty post and you do that. I'm like, dude, I don't even remember the last time I'll post like that, because it's not me. And I think if that is you, awesome, be yourself, own it, whatever. But if it's not you, just because you see it's being rewarded doesn't mean you need to do it. And let's take that into the actual context of a bikini competition prep. There are some women who are blessed genetically as well. You might see them engaged in a behavior that you think you should engage in, but actually it wouldn't be most beneficial for you. If someone's just doing, like, let's say, booty accessory movements, and they have this really nice glute profile and they look amazing on stage, and you think, well, I'll just do accessory work. You could be missing out on so much potential because you're copying something that's being rewarded on stage, but it's not indicative of where you're at. So there is a reason why women do it. Also, women are more, people will take this the wrong way, but women are more likely to fall into patterns of caring about people versus things. So if they can maintain community and they can maintain connection, they're going to be more likely to protect that. And if that means that they need to kind of push their own boundaries or limits a little bit to maintain a sense of belonging, they most likely will. And this is definitely something we see in this sport, is when your sense of belonging in the sport gets threatened because now you're in an improvement season body, what you do is you start posting all your old prep photos and you never share your improvement season because you think that makes you more belonging in this, and it perpetuates. So we can actually change that by showing all of the phases, or promoting the practice that's best for you, or doing what actually is most aligned with your values. So yeah.
Absolutely. And there's a lot in there that I kind of want to pick apart. Validation being one of them. And I think validation drives a lot of this behavior. And there's nothing, like, we're wired as humans to seek some level of validation and like people to clap for our achievements and stuff. So I'm not saying that validation is inherently wrong or bad. But I think that it can drive behavior. And I think it's just being conscious of these things and understanding them on a little bit deeper of a level. I talk about the gray area a lot, where we're talking in nuance. And I think it's a very easy like pathway for people to take to just think black and white, right? It's like, oh, somebody did this, they got this, and I'm going to do that now. So it's like, that's kind of what you're saying. And it's like becoming a little bit more consciously aware of these things and understanding them on a little bit deeper of a level. I'm not saying you have to understand the like complex meanings of life in every way, shape, and form, but at least trying to like dig into like, wait, why am I doing this? Like, what, like, maybe ask yourself why, you know, like, why am I really seeking this? Maybe not, try not to negotiate with yourself about it. Try not to justify things with just whatever, slapping whatever on it. Really dig in and understand what's driving your behaviors, because, you know, you're probably going to end up a lot more satisfied with whatever validation you do get in the process. And people are going to really give you genuine claps instead of just, you know, oh my God, you look awesome. Because a lot of times the validation that feels a lot better is like the actual prep, or like the process of the prep, because people are like, oh, you're like really digging in and doing all this crazy work and things that people would quote unquote never be able to do or whatever, and they're giving you that validation is going to feel a lot more fulfilling. Or if you're helping others and like what you're doing, which is awesome, and like putting this information out there for people to understand and bringing awareness to these things, that probably feels a lot better than posting a picture in lingerie, right? So, yes. And I'm not saying that posting a picture in lingerie is necessarily wrong by any means, or that there's anything inherently bad about it, but it's just understanding what's driving these behaviors and why you're doing them is important, and probably going to lead to you being a much more happy and fulfilled person. And maybe not doing what others are doing just because like you want to be like them, or some level of kind of like groupthink kind of behavior. Or you know, we see this a lot more in bikini too. I've observed is like joining like big teams, right? So like bikini competitors join these teams with coaches and coaching teams. And again, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it's just being conscious of what's driving that behavior. So if you're joining a team just because you see everybody else flocking to that team, maybe that's not the best reason to be joining that team, right? So that's like another thing that you didn't quite mention. And I think there's a lot of contributing factors to these behaviors. So being conscious of that, conscious of what's driving the validation too, because one thing I harp on a lot, and this is gonna be maybe a little bit controversial too, is like a lot of men blame women for the behavior, right? They're like, why are you posting these promiscuous pictures, blah blah blah, right? But it's the same men are the ones liking the picture.
Thank you, Sean. Yes. Oh my gosh, it's nice to hear a man say that. Like, I can't even tell you, men will, not men because you're man, but some men will be like so displacing of their responsibility on the women, and yet so they'll say to their women, you know, like, oh, I like how you're this, and I like how you're natural, I like how you look like this. But then on Instagram, they're following like these types of women and they're validating those women, and it creates this weird standard. So I love that you just said like there's a blame on women. Similarly, that men do things to attract females. Men do and change things, and they do things because they think it'll curate an image of themselves to attract a female. And so it is this beautiful dance between men and women. But it comes with a cost if it's not who you really are or what you really appreciate.
Absolutely. So it's being conscious of where that validation is coming from. If they're coming from met like a bunch of men that are just porn addicted guys that just are obsessed over pictures online. It's like, maybe that's not the right validation. It may feel good in the moment, and also take into consideration that some of that validation that's flocking into another girl's post may be from that as well. So it's being conscious of that. Maybe they're being rewarded by something that isn't very fulfilling. Like, that's a very empty source of validation versus a post that may not get as many likes, but it has a lot of more meaning behind it, and you may be positively impacting somebody else's life. You're going to feel a lot happier at the end of the day and a lot more fulfilled too. So it's, under at least having the conscious awareness of these things and understanding of the inner workings of these things. I'm not saying don't do it. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I would almost encourage it to some extent, but it's just understand where that validation is coming from and understand where the validation is flocking in when you see other people doing it. And then you also mentioned like exercise stuff, and that's like fitness influencer stuff that we discuss all the time, right? It's like, so-and-so does this exercise, so I want to do it, right? And a lot of the times that's probably not the best route for you to take. So what are some other things you see people doing or gravitating towards on social media, since we're kind of on this topic, that may not be the best practices, and maybe things to stay away from, maybe things to be more conscious of in terms of what you're subscribing to and paying attention to on social media?
Yes. Well, I think you make a great point that we're not saying not to do certain things. We're saying to ask yourself why you're doing those things. So when you receive feedback, you're able to put it through a filter that considers if that feedback is meaningful to you. And I think that's the distinction. You could post a great, beautiful, amazing, sexy photo and feel awesome about yourself because you had the choice to do that. You decided to. It was really based in your values and you wanted to do that and to feel good. And you got all your women friends and they're hyping you up. It feels amazing. You have this community, this connection. But like you said, it's put it through a filter essentially when you ask yourself why. So that's good. And I think other dangerous behaviors online that I see perpetuated is social media gives us this narrowed feeling or view on the world where we feel like everyone exists in this bubble with us, that we almost forget about all these other things in life that could also matter. There was a time where I literally thought most people knew who Miss Bikini Olympia was. Why? Because all I did was follow bikini competitors, bodybuilders. My whole feed was fitness influence. Everything was that. But I would go out and I'd be like, oh yeah, like why are you working out so hard? You're here every day. Well, I'm a competitor. A competitor, what's that? They don't even know. Like, they don't even know what a bikini competitor is. So I think social media, if we get too fixated on our community that we're really excited about, that we forget other aspects of life that also excite us, it could actually change the way we're perceiving the world around us. And that could be also detrimental because you might become more closed-minded to why someone might be saying or asking or responding to what you do in a certain way. That tends to lead you to a cutout mentality. I'm going to cut out these people from my life, instead of seeing, well, maybe those are the people you go on hikes with. Those are the people you go to the coffee shop with. They're not people you go to the gym to crush legs with, like that might not be what you do. But I think what you can do to mitigate this is follow other things of interest. Like, when I realized my feed was just so much fitness, and then I was like participating in an upward comparison that limited my view of myself and the world, I was like, wait. I'm actually interested in art, dogs, babies. I want to see all of this. Like, I want to subscribe to this person who posts scripture and this page that promotes something positive. And now I'm interested in therapy memes because I'm going through it in my internship, and then my world just started like, oh yeah, it's not just this. And that means I'm not just that either. And that, I think, is a mistake people make, is that we get too honed in on this vision of life, and it forgets other things that matter.
I'm a huge proponent of being very selective with the channels you choose to subscribe to on any social media platform, television, whatever it may be. I very rarely watch any television. I don't even watch movies. Anything that I'm taking in, I want it to be providing me some level of value, positive value. And if I want something a little bit more simple, I'll gravitate towards something a little bit more simple. If I'm trying to relax maybe and maybe not be as mentally stimulated, and things like that. So I recommend, we talked a lot about eating disorder stuff. So, maybe not following every food page imaginable
Yes.
is probably a good strategy. And try not to subscribe to things that are just negative, like bad news, or I don't necessarily have anything negative to say about the people that do this, but maybe pages that like call people out all the time. Like I don't really like subscribing to those. Like it doesn't really contribute anything positive to me, or viewing people in a negative light. I don't like to watch the news. I always say, like, if something's bad enough, like one of my parent figures will text me about it, like a hurricane's coming or something, since I'm in Houston. Like I'll hear about it from somebody. Somebody will tell me that something really bad's happening. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. I don't even follow that. Like people will be like, I just found out about who's competing in the Arnold like a couple of weeks ago, and like I'm a coach, so I don't really follow that many competitors even, or pros. I follow other coaches that I'm friends with, and like I follow a lot of like car accounts and like architecture stuff and whatever, So I encourage people to find things that really like light a creative fire in you, and kind of not distract you, but contribute to other areas of your life outside of competing, right?
Yes, and especially for women too, then and I'm sure for men as well, but I think it's a little different as far as like what we gravitate towards. But like for women especially, it will foster better conversations that aren't so fixated on weight, body, fitness. Instead, you might be having conversations about like a new recipe or something that is interesting to you, or that made you think differently, or just a cute, like I'll send like a cute little, like it's like Winnie the Pooh with a cute little saying, and I get to send it to my friend and wish her a good day. Like it creates a conversation I want to be having. I had a conversation with my friend recently. I sent her this funny reel of this. Well, it wasn't funny. It was funny because I perceived it as funny. It was this group of people talking about like sources of food or whatever. And I was like, dude, this is the type of stuff that I don't want to sit around at Thanksgiving and hear about. Like this is the stuff that makes me go sit with the dog on the couch. And she was like, oh my gosh, like so much of the health industry has become so like fixated on these little details that it's almost like pretentious, and it feels really icky. So like you said, like maybe not following things that make you feel icky, or like that you wouldn't want to engage with if you were out and about with your friends. Is that really the conversation you want to have around the table? If not, then why are we introducing it to our mind consistently?
Absolutely. And one thing that we haven't really touched on, and you kind of like maybe touched on it a little bit, is like community. So like community outside of bodybuilding too, making sure you're connecting with people outside of bodybuilding, whether that's like local, like you go to your local coffee shop, or maybe join a club, like a local club that has nothing to do with bodybuilding. I see some competitors starting to do more of that, which I'm really appreciative of, and I make sure to like give them a lot of props for doing that kind of stuff. A friend of mine that's coming on the podcast next week, Noah McCabe. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her.
I had her on mine.
She's a great example of this, because she's doing she joined a bunch of clubs. She's doing like public speaking stuff, like all kinds of stuff. That's part of why I'm doing this podcast, because as you can tell, like I have a lot to say and a lot up here, but I don't necessarily always have the best time like turning it into words. So like this is part of why I'm doing podcasting, for example. So finding other things and skills you want to develop as a person outside of just this competitive world that we live in with bodybuilding is really important. And what are some other things that you participate in to like help build community outside of bodybuilding?
Well, I can't say my podcast because that's totally bodybuilding. But I guess it allows me to create friendships within the sport that focus on other things too. Like there's so many women I've become friends with through the podcast and through this sport that then we'll just talk on a random Saturday and like catch up and have a conversation about life, not even about competing. But for me, I really like to engage with my family the most. I just moved to a new state, so like I'm like trying to figure out where I'm going to be going, I'm like, I don't know anybody, I don't know anything. But previously it was a lot of volunteering. I liked going to church as well. Right now I'm attending online. But then my family is the biggest one for me. Like the amount of time I spend with them, and my dad has a good community where he lives. So I've gotten to spend time with them playing pickleball. Like that's something I like to do, is play pickleball, do other things. I used to do like other sports too during this that helped me to get more focused, but I'm also business minded and oriented. So connecting with other entrepreneurs has always been really important to me. Having other people in my circle who are doing things that are improving the community they're trying to serve, that makes me feel connected. And I have friends who don't compete, and I stay in, like, I have one of my best friend. She doesn't compete, but she's learned all about it, so we can talk about it, she even knows about Nick Walker. Like, that's crazy. Like, she didn't even just explore like bikini. She like got into it. But we talk every single week, and that's a really valuable time in my schedule because it's completely just connection time with my bestie. And outside of that, hiking. I used to, like, when I lived in Arizona, I had a great friend group, and we would like go hiking and do anything really, go to coffee shops. I think even just doing something like that and talking to people there, or going to the library or the bookstore, like just seeing other people. But yeah, I honestly, like, most of my hobbies, Sean, I'll be for real, are the gym and that's, the gym and my business, but and my family. That's my focus right now.
Yeah, I think us as humans, we are wired to build community, and bodybuilding, well, the world we live in today and the environment we're in with social media and all these different things, they can be very powerful tools for very positive things, but they also prevent us from making a lot of the connections that we'd be making in person without it, right? So I think it's really important to be intentional about this, even if you're not a competitor, is making sure that you're trying to build community, connecting with your family, and connecting with them in person, and actually going and experiencing in-person connection with people is extremely valuable. You have your family, whether you go to church, and religion's a great outlet for this as well, and just joining up with people and doing something outside of bodybuilding is, I think, probably one of the most positively impactful things you can do for your mental health. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think otherwise it's so isolating, and you get in that tunnel vision, and also you become more selfish. Like, a life worth living is not a selfish one. You're going to get to the end of your road with your prep. No one's going to be there for you because you couldn't prioritize other people outside of yourself because your view became so narrow. So I think it's not just healthy because you have someone you can support and be supported by. It is so beneficial just to know that you support somebody else too. You have a purpose in somebody's life. And I think because this sport can be isolating for people, it can lead you to a dark path of feeling like your life isn't meaningful to somebody else's, and you don't have a role in their life because of that. And that's such a dangerous thing because you said it, we're communal beings. Our world has shifted so much. Like, if we go way, way back, like, we used to actually have villages raise a child, right? Like, that was actually what it was. Like, it took a village. Now it's like, I don't go next door to ask my neighbor for an egg. And I'm not saying you need to, but like, I remember growing up as a kid, like, my parents would say, go ask if they have it, or they'd show up. And now that doesn't happen because we've created a more individualistic society, because it's actually promoted growth in finances, especially. Like, that's what's driving most of the world right now, unfortunately. But because of that, there's been a disconnection from community. So I think it's healthy because it renews your perspective for yourself and for others too, and your meaning in life.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. And I also think too, and I speak from experience with this because I am very, very introverted, and I always have been. I was a very, very shy kid, and I get social anxiety. I still get this stuff, and and it's like one of those things. Like, no matter how much, because the body adapts and the mind adapts to stress, right? But it's one of those things where I had to become very self-aware of it, because no matter how much I expose myself to the stress, I just don't adapt. Like, and
Same.
just never gets better. So I think that a lot of people a lot of introverts gravitate towards the sport because it's so individualized, and it's so like monk-like too, the lifestyle, where you really like keep to yourself. You're like on the Stairmaster with your hood up and your headphones on, or you're in the gym, you have your headphones on and you're just zoned out and like very introspective and focused on what you're doing. But you're still like able to be around people to some extent. So I think it's important for competitors to be aware of that, because I think that a lot of competitors are introverts. And so when you're depriving, you're already relatively deprived of that connection, and then you're depriving yourself even more. That could be pretty detrimental to your health and probably drive some of these other behaviors that we've discussed as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, that is why I started my podcast, because I was like, all I do is study online and work online. I don't talk to anybody. And then I go to the gym, and even if I have my headphones out, I'm like shooting the shit with a couple old guys because it's 5 a.m. and I'm just like, that's who's at the gym. And it's great. They were my people back then, but like at the same time, I was like, I don't talk to anybody other than a discussion board that I'm getting graded on and I'm literally being rewarded for. So starting the podcast, like, oh wow, I'm communicating with people more. And then like obviously counseling, you're constantly connecting with people, but it's a different dynamic. But I'm like, anytime I go to an event, even in the bodybuilding community where people, I think, assume I'm more I mean, I guess if you put it on a scale, maybe I'm higher in extroversion than somebody else. But generally speaking, like, I'm very nervous. And like you said, no matter how many times I expose myself, I'll still be like calling my friend, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to go in there. I don't think I can do it. Like, I don't want to talk. What if I don't have anyone? Like, I go through every scenario and then I get there and I'm fine. But it doesn't change my perception of it. And I don't know, me and you could probably talk about that forever, but I feel like some of that's rooted in like childhood experiences, even where I'm like, I was like really like self-conscious even then about that and how I was perceived or interacted with people. Or I was also a younger sibling. And I remember like if I said something, it was very much like we would joke around a lot in my family. So then it was like, oh, that was kind of a put down. Maybe I shouldn't share that or say that. And so you get, I don't know. Yeah, like I said, we could process that forever, but I do agree that it attracts a lot of introverts.
Yeah, I read a book a while ago called Quiet by Susan Cain, and it's kind of dives into the differences between introverts and extroverts. And a lot of it comes down to like how easily stimulated you get to your environment. Experiments they've done with like babies, for example, they'll like play music, and babies that get upset to the like certain sounds and stuff, and are easily upsetted by the sounds to end up being introverts. And the babies that just are able to sleep through like music and noises and stuff are end up being extroverted. So a lot of it's just how much your nervous system is stimulated by like sounds and interactions with people and all that kind of stuff. So it's something to be a little bit more aware of, and I think that a lot of people can benefit from becoming more aware of and self-aware of. And I do think it's very much on a spectrum where people are like, well, I'm this and I'm this, but you kind of, because I'm, like I said, I'm very observant and kind of psychoanalytical with people. So I'm like, I don't know, like you seem to get pretty drained after like social interaction, and you need like people that need their space and stuff, or tend to be a little bit more introverted. I don't know about you too. Like whenever I have kind of a negative interaction or like a difficult conversation, or maybe somebody just like I go through like some sort of separation with somebody or falling out, and they just really don't seem to like me. And it's like I put my best foot forward, whatever. I tend to isolate myself even more, because I'm like, it's like that learning thing where you like we talked about, where you're like, okay, that was bad. I need to not do that again. And then I'm like, even more so, I think with competing, it's important to be conscious of that, because if we have like a negative interaction within the industry, we'll like be even more reclusive, and then it's just like you're completely isolated. There's been times, and since I'm a coach too and I work from home most of the time, there's like I'm like shit, I haven't left my apartment in like 3 days. I need to go somewhere,
Literally though, like there's times where I'm like, okay, where have I been other than the grocery store and the gym this week? And I'm like, nowhere. I've done nothing else. And then when you are looking at a screen all day, that time can pass so fast. Like you literally realize I didn't even go out. I don't even know if the sun shined today because I was just in here. And also to your point about the spectrum of these things, I think some of us who are maybe more naturally, like if you took on a personality test and you put this on a scale, maybe you are lower in extroversion, so you're higher in introversion. And then what we see happen sometimes is introverts learn how to exude this level of extroversion to appear, prepared, but they are the ones who then, as soon as that's done, they're exhausted because they were not wearing a mask. I don't know if that's the right word, because you're still being your authentic self, but it's very much like you almost, I personally feel this obligation to be, like you said, put your best foot forward, but like in a way that I will beat myself up if I feel like someone came to me and I couldn't give them my full attention because I wasn't energetically prepared for it. And then I'll like ruminate on it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I probably should have said this or I did this. And then I like see them and they're so happy to see me the next time. And I'm like, so you probably didn't even think about that interaction ever again.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't relate more, to be honest. Like, and since we're professionals too, we kind of have to put on a show. We have to act a little bit, right? Like, if I was if I went to a bodybuilding contest, for example, say I'm at nationals, and I was just truly myself, I'd probably be hiding in a corner, you know, and people probably wouldn't hire me. So, like, I kind of have to put on this act and, like you said, a little bit of a mask to some extent, where I'm like, "What's going on, man?" Like, blah blah blah, just like walking up to people, like, "Haven't seen you in a while. Like, do you have anybody competing today?" Like that kind of stuff. And it's draining, though. It is so draining. And then there's like certain things that you like, damn, I kind of overshared there, or like I could have said something different there, and then you're like mortified and like cringing at yourself for like 3 days afterwards, and you're like,
at least. And then I'm like so avoidant of small talk that's why I overshare, because I'm like, well, I don't want to talk about the weather or what this person's doing, which is what most people do. So I'm going to tell you about something really traumatic that happened to me. Like, oh my gosh. But to some extent, it's probably good because we foster deeper and more vulnerable, I think, connections because of our ability or willingness to prefer or have a preference to a one-to-one connection versus a one-to-many, at least in friend circles in those settings. Like if you put me in a circle of people, I'm not going to be this talkative that I'm being with you. I'm probably going to just like listen a lot. And I may not speak unless someone calls me into it or it's something I'm really interested in. And I had an ex like years ago, and he was like, you never talk when we go out. And I'm like, I have nothing to say. And he's like, what do you mean you have nothing to say? I'm like, I literally, what am I going to say about like this type of apple that was being discussed? I don't have an allegiance to this. I'm a gala apple girl. And they're talking about, this one. I'm like, I just don't, what am I going to say to that? And he's like, it's just weird because you're so quiet. And I'm like, well, you do all the talking for me then, because I am not like it's unless it sparks something in me where I feel extra confident that I can speak up. The marker of introversion is you're just slower to speak than the person just higher than you in extroversion. So if you're a 67% extroverted and I'm 69% extroverted, I'm probably going to speak just that much faster than you are. So that's why you then appear way more introverted, even than you maybe actually are.
100%. I like that you brought up like intimate relationships too, because that's like a non-negotiable for me. It's like that's something I communicate out the gate. It's like I am very introverted, so you need to know that about me, and like that is something that is kind of important because it's like you have to be really intentional when it comes to like social interactions, or you go to like a gathering, birthday party, whatever it may be. It's like you have to be conscious of that. Like I may ask you to kind of lead the situation a little bit, or I may be a little bit attached to your side. Like, and if you lead me somewhere, I'm gonna be like, I'm probably gonna go hide in the corner or something. So
that's what I do. I literally like I'll be at a wedding and I'm like, that fan over there looks real nice. And I don't even care. Like, I'm actually quite comfortable with that now. I used to think like, oh my gosh, people are judging me because I'm just sitting here in front of this fan. But now I'm like, actually, I don't really care. This is like really nice. I did enough talking for now. And also, if you grow up, I think, in a family of people who are way more extroverted than you, like my mom was so extroverted, I think you maybe are less likely to, just because you don't have as many chances to say something. And then, like you said, in intimate relationships or partnerships, I think introverts do tend to sometimes appreciate, like my dad, so introverted. So my mom did all the entertaining, the talking, all of it. He didn't even have to worry about it. Now that she's gone, he's become more extroverted, which I think is because it's a necessity now, So it's so fascinating what we might feel comfortable with and gravitate towards. I'm very much like you. I'm like, we're going to be buddies in this. And if we're not, like, don't be mad when you see me over there or trying to find one person that I might speak to this entire night.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's one of the most important things you can be self-aware of, and try not to be like, try to dig deeper into it instead of just being like, oh, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. Like, really analyze like how you're affected by social interaction, like how you feel. Like, do you need recovery afterwards? Do you come home from a party and you're like energized? You're like, I want more of that. Like, really analyze and see how you feel. And because that's going to benefit relationships, you can be more intentional, especially if you're a competitor. Like during contest preps, you can be a lot more intentional. If you're an extrovert too, and you're refraining from social interaction, like you could be really affected by that negatively. So being really intentional about that too. If you're in a contest prep and you're maybe not able to fulfill as many social obligations as before, maybe be intentional about like going and joining a club or whatever it may be. So I've been intentional too. Like and people, it's cool because people are seeing this kind of unfold here with you and I, where we're having this one-on-one conversation, and we're able to like be more ourselves and talk about it, be relatively vulnerable. So like I like to play chess a lot. Chess is a really good one because it's you sit down, it's one-on-one, right? And so recently, like I'll be playing I'll play chess with somebody at like a coffee shop or something, and other people will come by like, oh my god, is that a chessboard? And it's like, yeah, let's exchange contact, maybe we can meet up at a coffee shop and play chess. And so it's just
Wow.
that you're like being really intentional, where it's one-on-one interaction with somebody. It could be a complete stranger, and it's like such a simple thing to relate to. It's like, oh, we're just playing chess, so
That's so cool. And that's like totally feeding your competitive nature, I imagine.
yeah, exactly. So I'm around people, but most people are like on their computers working, and I'm just like engaged with one individual, and we just have one objective, and that's to play chess. So like really
Uh,
simple thing, so I can like fulfill that need to some extent without really exhausting myself. And then coaching can be extremely exhausting because we have athletes with a lot of needs, and we're expending a lot of that energy to our athletes throughout the day. So we can be left very drained at the end of the day. So it's important to be intentional about that, right?
yeah, honestly, especially like through counseling. And I know it's so similar with coaching too, because it's these pretty intimate conversations generally. But like sometimes in the counseling work, I remember just, especially at the center. I mean, now it's more so a little bit more predictable because I'm very niched. But like when I was working at the counseling center, there was limited breaks and I didn't have control over my schedule there. So we'd be going from one client to the next, to the next, to the next. And I just remember being like, I need to, like, I don't know if I took a deep breath in these 4 hours, because other than when I'm doing it to regulate with the client, because outside of that, I'm like, oh, it just feels like draining. And then I get to the end of my day and I'm like, I can knock the heck out. Like I can go straight to sleep. But even like going to events and stuff, like I host tons of events. I love hosting events. I love speaking at events, hosting them, all of that. But like I'm guarantee you, my Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, all of that is, it's not just the Friday, Saturday the event is, it is, or the Sunday, it is Monday and Tuesday. Like that's blocked. And when I don't block it, I will sleep sometimes for like 10 to 14 hours because I just need it. Like I can't not reset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like after a bodybuilding contest, if I'm present at a bodybuilding contest and I'm there the whole weekend and I've like given so much of myself to my athletes and I've like been interacting with everybody, I will literally go like just hibernate. Like it's like
Do you ever feel pressure from your clients or from other people at shows to like be super extroverted or engaged with them?
I mean, I feel pressure from just myself as a professional to make connections and to network and to give a lot of myself to my athletes if I am there and available. And I think that that's a lot of just internal drive to serve people around me. And it's like it's a discipline thing to some extent because it's like doing something I don't necessarily feel like doing, but I know it's the right thing to do, and it's going to help me create a bigger impact, a positive impact for people. But most of the time, with any other social interaction that's not needed, I'm just like, leave me out of it. I'm big with setting boundaries. Like I put up boundaries everywhere. I'm like, nope, I don't do that. I don't do this. I set boundaries with myself too. I'm like, I say no. I love saying no. I'm like,
What are
no.
some of your big no's?
Like if it's like a party or just anything that's really like I really just or I get invited to a bar, it is a hard no. Like it is unless I feel like it's going to benefit me business wise to some extent or a relatively great extent, I will say no. A lot of man, what are some of my other no's? I really try to shut down drama. Like if I sense drama, I'm just like, no, I want nothing to do with it. I would rather detach now, or
Mhm.
like, let's distance ourselves now, or like give me a moment to really sit back or give you a moment to sit back and really like gather yourself emotionally before we have this interaction. Um, that kind of stuff. I'm very consciously aware, and I'm not hesitant to say no. I would say it really depends on the situation.
I'm getting better at saying no, but it's not it's not what I gravitate towards. I generally, I think, overextend myself in an effort to comfort and please others at the sacrifice of myself. But I'm learning through recent experiences of where that was like I was really taken advantage of or taken for granted in those ways where I realized, oh, it's actually like it's okay to do that, but not for everybody all the time. And it's beneficial to protect that. So I'm learning how to better set and maintain boundaries with I'm very good at maintaining boundaries with myself. Like if I make a commitment to myself, it's like, yep, that's fine. But with others, it's sometimes a little bit more challenging for me. But I've gotten better when I see the result of not doing it. And then I'm like, okay, it's too high risk not to. But like you said, I'm not going to go to a bar, but if I'm invited to a cocktail party, I'm going to go and chat, but I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to make myself vulnerable to any potential like exposure to something I wouldn't do by myself or normally. So I think I have some strong no's in my life as well that are just like not part of who I am. So it's easier in those situations. But when it's somewhat part of who I am, like somewhat like, oh, can you do this? I'm like, yes, of course. And then later I'm like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just being really understanding and aware of what is important to you and like your stack of, because I always kind of tell people it's important to really understand your priorities. And I usually try to like place them into like 5 major baskets. Like, what are the 5 main priorities you have and where are they? So I usually say like family and intimate relationships and business are like my top 2. And I wouldn't place them 1 or 2 because my business enables me to be able to provide to my family and my intimate relationships. So I have to be conscious of that in terms of how I'm toggling that. And that's important to be aware of and something I'm always like conscious of, because sometimes I have to prioritize the grind in order to be able to better serve and provide for others. Right. So it's being really conscious of those things is very important. And then placing like the rest of your priorities. So like if I'm presented an opportunity to do something, I ask myself, like, is that fulfilling any of my main priorities? And if it's not, then I'm not going to do it. And so a lot of it's just not being impulsive of yes and no, or like, oh my God, that's exciting. It's like, it's almost like an emotional intelligence thing to some extent, because you're saying like, what, like, instead of just jumping at excitement, it's like, let me think about this for a second. And it's also important, like communication has been such a big focus of mine over the years, especially to like overcompensate for how introverted I am. But also like not being scared of being like telling people like, hey, I need a moment to think about this. Like I'm not going to say yes or no right now. It's like, let me get back to you, and like stepping away from it. And that way your decision of yes or no isn't emotionally driven. You're not saying no because you're just like immediately like turned off by it. And you're not saying yes because you're not immediately like excited by it. You take a step back, you ask yourself, is it like helping drive those priorities that you have? And I think that's a really valuable thing for people to do.
That is good. But yeah, you have to know what your priorities are in order to do that. Just like I base everything on my values, which is freedom, impact, and love. And so that is what generally guides my decision making. Although I really like what you said about not saying something out of emotion. I generally, especially if I'm processing something someone said to me, I'm like, I owe you a genuine response that I can't actually give you right now because I need more space and time to process it. Whereas I think a less mature version of me used to feel like I owed someone a response right away. And I'm like, I can't give them a response that's actually representative of how I feel because I don't even know how I feel yet. And so I learned the hard way in some instances of how responding too soon or giving an answer so quick actually led to negative outcomes.
I think that's some level of like immediate slash delayed gratification kind of piece as well, because it's like you're going to feel good based on their response to some extent, right? If they're like, oh my God, I'm so excited that you're joining us, like that's going to feel good, right? Versus like, you're like, hey, I need a moment to think about this. They're going to be like, oh, and you kind of feel that energy coming off of them. So it may not feel good in the moment, but when you come back and you're like, hey, this is the decision I made, they're probably going to respect you a lot more. And that's like a delayed gratification thing. So it may not feel good in the moment, but over a period of time, they're going to respect you a lot more, respect like the way you communicate a lot more. You may be able to build a much stronger relationship with them as well. So I think that it kind of is just like if you go out to eat during prep. I encourage athletes to go out to eat during prep. I think the less you deprive yourself, the better on the front end. If you may want to catch that sooner, where it's like, hey, like I'm going to go out to eat with family, for example, but I'm going to like communicate extremely well to them that I'm doing this thing. It's extremely important to me, and I'm going to watch y'all eat. Or you bring your Tupperware or whatever it may be, and you're like, hey, I'm literally just going to watch you guys eat. It's really important for me to be doing this thing that I'm doing. It's important for me to be sitting down with you guys and interacting with you guys and spending quality time with you guys. So please understand that and respect that. And then you may get shit on the front end. Like they may be like, oh, this is weird, whatever, making their comments and stuff, or like, oh, you can't just eat this, like whatever, like that, the typical comments. But at the end of the day, long term, you're going to be able to build stronger relationships with them. They're going to respect you a lot more long term, and respect that you're following through with your decisions. And you're going to get more confidence out of that too. I think a lot of confidence building comes from you following through with what you say you're going to do, right? So anytime that you don't do that, you say you're going to do something and you don't, you negotiate with yourself, you're just destroying your self-confidence. You're losing trust in yourself that you're going to be able to fulfill the things that you've set out to do. And so a lot of that trickles down, and people respect you so much more when you have that genuine confidence from being like, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to thoroughly communicate it with people so that they understand, and I'm not going to like fold to any pressure of like not fulfilling what I've set out to do. And people may give you shit on the front end, but they will respect you a lot more. And then we see that manifested in entrepreneurship a lot too, because you'll maybe be like, hey, I'm going to quit my 9 to 5 and go start this business, whatever, right? That's like a typical story you hear. And people will give you shit like, oh, like that's not going to work out, or blah, blah, blah. You may hear their doubts, but if you fulfill that and you really follow through and you don't listen to the negativity, those people are going to be the ones like, how'd you do that? Blah, blah, blah. Like, right. That's like the typical story you hear. So that's like a big macro manifestation of that, I think.
So true. Oh my gosh, every example of that is great. And I like how you emphasize the importance of communicating. So many times people just run away from the communication aspect because they're fearful of the response, and having to actually like grow in that communication with someone, or the moment they get pushback, it's like, well, now I don't know what to do with it. And something I encourage a lot of my clients to do is say, when you blank, I feel blank. Like when you shove food in my face while we're out to eat, I feel like you don't respect my goals, but usually you are respectful of what I'm aspiring to achieve. Can you help me understand why this might be different? And you encourage a conversation with someone to understand where they're coming from, instead of immediately being like, well, they don't support me and I'm done. When in reality, they're like, well, I miss the old version of you that would come out and have Taco Tuesday with us. And then you're able to say, well, I understand that, but you know what's really valuable to me about it, and is exactly what you said, which is sitting here with you, having that presence. But let me know if there's something else we can do that might satisfy your desire to maybe have some freedom or some fun with me. And that might look like trying a new hike, or going someplace new, or getting espresso shots. You know what I mean? Like, what if it's that instead? So I think being able to have those conversations, like you said, it creates a better relationship, and it sets a tone for how people think and believe they can talk to you, and what you're willing to tolerate. If you let people say and do certain things over and over again, you're telling them, I tolerate this communication and this behavior from you to the extent of which I'm uncomfortable with myself. But they don't care if you're uncomfortable, because you tolerate it. So sometimes when I'm struggling with it, I'm like, is this the precedent I want for this relationship moving forward? And if the answer is no, then I'm very motivated to set that boundary, where previously I might think that the perceived threat of setting the boundary is them judging me losing connection with them not wanting to be my friend anymore, whatever that perceived threat might be, or even scarcity, right? Like kind of a scarcity of opportunities to spend time with people, or a scarcity of the opportunities to take a business thing that was presented to you before saying yes and acting emotionally, as you mentioned earlier. So like sometimes I have to really think, well, what am I feeling is threatened in this moment by not actually speaking up for myself too?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why it's so important to set such firm boundaries with people and understand. A practice I like to do with myself sometimes is like think back to a time. And sometimes I can even remember in childhood situations where somebody gave me a hard no, and like how that felt, and like understanding how that felt for me. And then how did it manifest long term though? Like, I ended up respecting them a lot more. I was a lot less likely to cross their boundaries, and we had a better relationship after that, right? So think back to a time that you like put yourself in the other person's shoes in terms of what that feels like. It may not feel good in the present moment, and you're like, oh, that kind of made me feel uncomfortable, but you're like, now I'm more gravitated towards this person, I respect them more, and we're going to have a healthy relationship now, and I'm not going to cross their boundaries. So the food getting shoved in your face is a good example of this, because if you get food shoved in your face and you're like, oh, and you're not firm with the boundary, they're not going to get the message, and they're going to be like, oh, I'm going to be able to cross this boundary at some point. And that's not them being malevolent or anything. It's just like, it's just kind of human nature, right? So it's like shutting them down firm so that it's, they get some level of discomfort from it, but they're going to respect you a lot more. They're going to be like, oh, I respect this person's boundaries. They're doing something they said they were going to do, and they're holding firm to it, and I'm going to respect that moving forward. And so, I mean, a lot of respect is very much earned and not given. So it's just another way of earning respect. It's another way of building self-confidence. And it's something you can be very conscious of in social situations. And something I've had to develop a lot because of how introverted I am and kind of overcompensate to some extent is really just be like, no, like, don't do that. And it's as simple as that. And they're like, oh, shit. And then they have much more respect for me moving forward. And it's that simple, So think back to a time that somebody said no to you and how that felt, and then how you felt about them after that, though, as a person, right?
Yeah, now you're getting me thinking too. Like you've got me thinking this whole time, but especially that point just like really sat with me well. I think too, when I consider that, it's even more so beyond respect, but it takes me to a conversation that Jordan Peterson often has, which is that we're all playing this game, really. And so I think if someone isn't like so anti-social that they're able to read cues in such a way where they recognize like what you're willing to do or not do, then you'll play a longer game with them. And if the goal, like he says, is to play more games, then you kind of need to have those rules in a sense. And so that actually reminded me of that, because it's the same thing. Like if someone is playfully doing something that you're actually uncomfortable with, but you don't set a rule for that, you can't play the game in a fun way that would actually sustain the game continuing. So that helped me to conceptualize that differently.
Exactly. And like sustaining the game is like the important part, because you want to maintain those relationships and you want them to be healthy. And if you're not setting those rules and boundaries out the gate, then you're not going to be able to continue to play the game, and nobody's going to end up having fun. And though maybe the person that's crossing your boundaries maybe has some fun throwing around with you in the moment, but when the game's over, everybody's sad, So
yes,
like setting it up so we can have a fun game and everybody's like on board with what's going on. And a lot of it's like just understanding and having some level of agreement too. You're making an agreement with somebody when you get into any kind of relationship. It's like, hey, these are like, you're kind of slowly incorporating these boundaries as you go. It's like we're creating building an agreement, almost like a contract to some extent, where it's like, okay, these are kind of the non-negotiables. We're in agreement to these things. We're on board. We have this like energy balance going now, and you kind of work these things out. And the sooner you catch that stuff on the front end, the longer that game is going to last, and the more fun everybody's going to have. And when it does end, you like shake hands, and it's like, okay, the game's over, and that's it. And relationships in any sense, whether it's intimate or just friendships, family, I express a lot with family stuff, because it is very important to like I don't think that there should be a separation here. I think that family should be included in all this. I don't think you should allow family to cross boundaries. I don't think you should allow just because they're family. I think that all these things should be firm in any relationship you have. Would you agree?
Yes, I remember when I first got into fitness, I used to always just bring my Tupperware to the family dinner table, which was not normal because at the time that was just new. And I would say, like, I enjoy sitting and eating with you guys. And then my dad would say, well, are you going to eat? And he would always ask, are you going to eat? And I was like, I literally am eating, but it's just not what you're eating, right? And I remember one time my mom was like, Jeff, I don't know how many times your daughter has to tell you that she is eating with us. She's just not eating what we're eating. So we don't have to ask her anymore. You know, you can assume now that she's not going to, but if she wants to and decides to, she'll tell us, and that'll be fine too. And it was like, I think when you have those boundaries for yourself and someone else recognizes it, they might also be your advocate and say, hey, wait, I don't think you're getting it, but I understand it. Let me help you conceptualize it because I had to as well. And so they can say it maybe differently. And like you said, even with intimate partners and relationships, setting, I think, oh my gosh, and I've made this mistake, but like setting definitions for what certain things mean and actually upholding those definitions is so important, because if you say like, well, how do you define a committed relationship? And they define it the same way you do, that's great. But the moment they act in a way that doesn't align with that, probably they're no longer playing the same game, right? Like now there's something else going on. There's a discrepancy that has to be addressed. And sometimes it's overcomable and sometimes it's not. But I think not compromising on the rules that are set, having an open mind where you can adapt, of course, to circumstances, but certain things I think you really have to know. Otherwise, it's like if you're playing any game, like if you're playing chess and some guy's like, well, that's not how you play it. You're like, this is the rule book. This is how you play chess. This is the one I'm abiding by. Either get on board or get out, you know? And that's because there's an understanding of what to expect.
Absolutely. I like the example you gave with the family, because sometimes those advocates too that are advocating for you and your boundaries, sometimes you can learn things from them too. Like maybe they saw something that you didn't and a way to communicate a boundary that you didn't too. And you can learn to better communicate those boundaries moving forward. Sometimes it's good to communicate those things ahead of time too. It's like, hey dad, just so you know, like it really makes me feel uncomfortable when you ask me if I'm going to be eating with the family. Can we make sure not to do that, please? And you set that boundary ahead of time, and then like nobody has to worry about it. And then you don't feel put on the spot in front of anybody. So you start to learn these things over time and better ways to set these boundaries and to be more firm with them and to catch them ahead of time, and how to communicate like, hey, I really don't like when you do this. I need you to stop. And then another important thing is if people continue to cross those boundaries, like you really sometimes you just have to step away, even if it's family, and separate yourself to some extent. And I really encourage people to do that. So yeah, it's really important stuff, but I feel like we could talk forever.
We can literally talk forever. Oh my gosh. I mean, I expected that because of how great our last conversation was, but like the way that transpired was like awesome. I forgot we were recording.
Well, now you've come to realize how many hours it takes to get me to start to open up, where I'm just like speaking my thoughts like accurately. So
well, like last time we talked, I'm like, I'm gonna get a smile out of him. I want to get a so I was like so happy to see that even more.
One of my favorite things, like when people ask me if, like, do you ever smile? I'm like, the world is a dark and dangerous place. That's just what I say. It's like, fuck them a little bit.
That's why you got to show your teeth. Let them know what you can do.
Yeah, that's part of why I'm podcasting too. But tell everybody where they can find your podcast. What other projects do you have in the works as well?
Yeah, so you guys can find my podcast on any streaming platform or on YouTube at celestial_fit. The podcast is Confessions of a Bikini Pro. I interview IFBB bikini pros, and sometimes I do coaches series and random features with promoters or just random. But generally every Friday it's the IFBB bikini pro being interviewed, not just about their process, but also all things life outside of the stage, which is why I have the message of build more than just a body, because I think that's what we're really doing. So yeah, you can also get all the resources I mentioned at celestial.fit. And then as far as new projects in the works, well, I've been building a podcast studio in my house because I really want to do like a Confessions of a Bikini Pro podcast experience where it's not just interviews, but we're doing like a day in the life, almost like recording them making their favorite meal and going to the gym and going out and just hanging, doing random stuff. So that has been in the works. It's taking longer than I expected because different things have come up, but that's something that I'm excited about. And then aside from that, just honestly, I'm speaking a lot more at a lot of events, and my main focus is just continuing to deliver. This year is different. Like I'm very much accepting a lot of opportunities that are coming up versus trying to plan a million events. And that feels really good. And yeah, my focus has just been on expanding my community. And I actually launched, and this is not something that's open for enrollment anymore, but I launched a 10-month psychoeducation and support group. And this has been a dream of mine for a while, since I started studying psychology before I even went to the clinical mental health counseling. And I was like, I really want a support group for people, and they can come to my house and they can stay with me, and it can be an intimate experience, and we'll also have meetings. So that is kicking off next month. And I'm like so excited about the group of women I have. They're amazing. And I think it's going to be super transformative.
Well, I think everything you're doing is absolutely incredible. I admire you a lot as a person, and I'm extremely grateful for you coming on. I think that you're going to continue to do a lot of amazing things for the world and our bodybuilding community. I think the things that you provide, bikini competitors especially, is invaluable. And I think that there's so much that they can take from it. And I think that we provided a lot of value here today. So hopefully we can do a part 2 at some point as well.
Thank you for joining us. Your journey towards excellence does not end here. We're here to help guide you every step of the way. For more insights and to become a part of our community, follow and subscribe. Your feedback illuminates our path. Be sure to share your thoughts and stay tuned for more episodes.